You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Buongiorno. Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we're going to do a bit of opinion scholarship on kind of maybe an extension of some work that we've done in prior seasons. So you see a couple of books here to my side. We've talked about Edinger's book, The Eternal Drama, at length. I think it was in season 4. And then, of course, we've talked a lot about Jordan B. Peterson. And as you guys probably know, Jordan had I guess his first, you might say, academic work outside of his sort of popular, the two books that he wrote, 12 Rules for Life and 12 More Rules, which, I mean, they were important, but not academic in the way Maps of Meaning was. So this little ditty came out, We Who Wrestle with God. And when I started reading it and listening to the lectures on it, I noticed some tremendous similarities between these two books. So I had this as my kind of initial spark of creative insight. I wanted to kind of compare and contrast the way that Edinger talks about the Greek gods and the way that Jordan describes God as depicted in the stories in the Bible. And I thought I was going to be able to talk about this as a way of understanding, as a way of demonstrating how people, ancient people, formed the ideas that they have about God. And as I got into it, I realized this is a whole different story than I intended to tell. So really what happened was some kind of a 180 in the middle of this, where I started to make another kind of realization that we could talk a lot more directly about how polytheism and monotheism arise, and maybe talk about some controversial perspectives about which came first and why. And I've done that before, but these two books are going to give me an interesting way of doing that, that maybe haven't quite as explicitly done yet. So without further ado, I'm going to bring you today the Spirits of God. That's what we're going to call this little ditty here. Okay, so just to kind of intro, I mentioned one of my more controversial opinions that I've expressed on this podcast is that polytheism, the notion that the cosmos is inhabited and controlled by many distinct deities, exists only as a bastardization of an original monotheistic intuition common to human psychology. And I point to examples of deeply ancient religions that recognize many gods on the surface, but who understand them all to roll up, in a manner of speaking, to a single supreme being. For them, the gods are merely expressions of this single divine reality. Perhaps even a symbolic linguistic mechanism, like a way of talking about a thing which is beyond concepts. And this religious model was called henotheism, which anthropologists insist is distinct from monotheism and polytheism. I'm not convinced. On the contrary, I think a compelling argument can be made that the high God in henotheistic systems is the only God in those systems. The multiplicity of gods are far more symbolic than Orthodox anthropology insists. Like, even in those religions which do not hold an obvious belief in a high God, there are very often echoes of one which was once recognized. Okay, now this means something perhaps forgotten. And that brings us to today's episode. What I hope to demonstrate for you today is a paradoxical equivalency between notions of the divine as a single transcendent reality, God, and the pantheon of gods, which characterizes most ancient religious systems. You heard me right. Today, we're going to do the impossible. We're going to reconcile the many to the one, God with a capital G to the gods. The idea to hold in mind as we continue is the possibility of paleo-monotheism, an archaic form of spirituality which understood the non-physical or spiritual aspects of existence, things like thoughts, emotions, and instincts, as well as nature, things like ultimate origins, substance, and the forces of nature, as a singular reality. The divine as a singular reality. Now, this doesn't fit neatly into our modern rubric of what God is. It might not have been thought of as a being, for instance, but it shares the most fundamental aspects with it. Whether we imagine a non-personal idea of the divine, think the Tao of ancient China, or a being of one sort or other, the idea is of a single, unitive, creative force responsible for the cosmos and everything in it. It is from this unitive oneness that an idea eventually emerges, that nature is imbued with spirit. Right? If the divine is one, and yet you recognize it in discrete things or events in the world, well, you're forced to confront the religious mystery. You see the divine oneness fractured in a way, a oneness that finds itself in manyness, in plurality. And this is the idea of God in the world, or maybe even God as the world, and lends to the rise of a religious worldview called animism. And animism is a principal form of religion in tribal societies that live close to nature as our earliest ancestors did. It sees the cosmos as alive, as imbued with spirit. And so to them, the divine is everywhere. In the spirit of the stream and the mountain, in the sun and the stars, and of course, in the living. And from this pattern of recognizing the divine in the world, expressed in diverse ways, comes a psychological transition. The divine is paradoxically the spirit, and yet it is manifest as many unique and distinct spirits. God becomes gods. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call the fate of God. All right, so the great scholar of religion, Mircea Eliade, explained that there is a common fate that befalls supreme beings in primitive religions. And I can't help but see a connection between this and the birth of the gods with a lowercase g. In his book, The Sacred and the Profane, Eliade says, quote, "Supreme beings tend to disappear from the practice of religion, from cult. They depart from among men, withdraw to the sky, and become remote, inactive gods." And there's a word for this, a Latin phrase, I believe, dea otios, the idol god, right? And when they do, a polytheism of divine attributes floods in to fill that emptiness. It's an interesting phenomenon, especially in light of the fact that nearly every monotheism to arise in history came as a reform movement within an existing polytheistic system. Whether we consider the Aten monotheism of 14th century BC Egypt, the rise of Zoroastrianism in Persia, or even the Yahweh monotheism of the ancient Judeans, all of them claimed to be restoring the proper worship of the one God in a religion which had deteriorated into polytheism. And I want to give you an example, a tribal example, kind of a classical example, but it's one that we spoke about in a prior episode. I think we just called it God of the Omaha, maybe. It was about the Omaha Native American tribe and their ideas about God. And so I could just kind of give you a bit of an excerpt here. It might sound familiar, but it gives me a great example of what Eliade was describing about these high gods disappearing. So listen, the first quote comes from a famous book about the Omaha Indians by two authors, Fletcher and LaFleche, one of which was an Omaha native himself. It goes like this, quote, "The ancestors of the Omaha believed there was a supreme being whom they called Wakande. They believed that Wakande existed, but did not undertake to say how he existed. There was no worship or praying to him. Some addressed the sun as Wakande, though many did not. Some worshiped the thunder under his name. All right, so a couple of interesting things about this quote. Firstly, when they say that they acknowledge this supreme being, but they don't worship him, you can see exactly what Eliade was describing. Because they know that there is a supreme being above all of the other spirits, but they don't worship him. They might recognize him in the sun or the thunder or something like that, and worship them, worshiping God through them in a sense, right? But he seems to disappear. The other thing is, they said that they acknowledge he existed, but they don't say at all how he existed. That they don't condescend to suggest that they know anything about God, about Wakande, because that great thing is completely unknowable, undifferentiated. It's the religious mystery, the thing that is beyond knowledge, right? That's why they don't say how he exists, but they recognize him in things, right? The thunder, the sun, and so forth. So notice how Wakande represents an undefinable, abstract notion, right? The divine might be a good way of putting it, which is not identical to the sun or thunder, but they are worshipped under its name. Wakande isn't worshipped, but the sun and thunder are. They are not identical to Wakande, but there is something of Wakande in them. They are phenomena which are encounterable in a way Wakande is not. This is why they're worshipped. Think of this as a kind of intercession, as the Catholics would say. And they pray to Mother Mary and the saints, not because they are God, but because they are a direct connection to God. The same was the relationship between Wakande and the phenomena worshipped under its name. Okay, another quote, this one from a different book by Clark Whistler called North American Indians of the Plains, published in 1920. It says this: the Dakota use a term, Wakantanka, like the Omaha Wakonda, to mean the sacred ones. The Dakota recognize a kind of hierarchy in which the sun stands first as one of the Wankantaka. Of almost equal rank is the sky, the earth, and the rock. Next is the moon, then comes inferior beings, the buffalo, bear, the four winds, etc. So, Wakande is the divine, right? Pure and abstract. It is without form or particular expression. Why? Because it is all form, infinite, encompassing everything. Wakande is the sacred, the divine, and its forms are the sacred ones, right? Like the Dakota say, embodiments of God. God is manifest in the earth, in the sky, in the sun, etc. The trend we see in the Omaha example, common to tribal animism all over the world, is, as Eliade said, consistently away from the original notion of this abstract divine and towards its manifest forms. But why? It may seem like it, but this is no particular mystery. This is so because God's forms are seen to be less than the fullness of God, only part of it, and therefore approachable in a way a fully transcendent God cannot be. I'm reminded of the words of God in the book of Exodus. He says, quote, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Right? The fullness of God, that's unapproachable. Now, these forms or expressions of God are oddly specific and reliably patterned cross-culturally. They're not random, but tied to constellations of related qualities, like fertility and life, as an example. A deity of fertility and life can be petitioned for help in conceiving children, say, or helping to grow crops. A deity of war and death, for instance, could be petitioned for help in battle, etc. Such appeals to the divine are appropriately directed to the part of God which they are, rather than to the infinite transcendent whole. Of course, this is the case. It's psychologically obvious. And this, my friends, explains why God perpetually gives way to the gods. And that brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this one Evidence from Judaism. Okay, in the Old Testament and ancient Jewish literature, God interacts with his creation through intermediaries. Why? Well, because there's something which prevents direct interaction between God in its fullness and mankind. Okay, so what are these intermediaries? Well, sometimes it's a burning bush, sometimes a voice from heaven, but most often these are divine beings, angels. In these accounts, the divine appears as embodiments or incarnations of its own attributes. And these are the angels. Now, you might ask how I come to that conclusion and why I would assume biblical angels to be some like limited incarnations of the one God. And to that I say, it's not an assumption at all. It's a literal interpretation. Okay, just listen to what the names of the angels mean. Right? The angel Gabriel means God's strength. Raphael means God's healing. Uriel means God's light. And Remiel means God's mercy. They're his qualities, his attributes, pieces of him. Now, the existence of these angels means that God is all of the qualities they represent. God is strength, healing, light, and mercy. Now, he may be other things besides, infinitely more, but we can know from the angels that he is at least these. And this approach to knowing God is a kind of circumambulation of God, a spiraling around its essence, getting closer and closer, but never quite fully there. It's a way of knowing the infinite and unknowable by encountering finite expressions, which are knowable and approachable in a way that the full glory of God is not. Okay, that brings me to a small piece. I'm just going to call this one God and its attributes, coming to know the unknowable. So I propose that it is possible to reconstruct what the ancients believed about the nature of the divine by examining the constellation of qualities which our ancestors embodied in their pantheons. Okay, and there are two authors that I've come across that do this type of analysis. Interestingly, both come from the psychoanalytic tradition of psychology. Ed Ettinger does this with the classical religion of ancient Greece. And Jordan Peterson, interestingly, does it with the narrative framework of the Bible. Now, in an effort to keep things chronological, let's begin with the Greeks, and I'll show you how this works. That brings me to this Ed Ettinger example. So this comes from the book, The Eternal Drama. And in this book, Ettinger lays out the qualities and attributes, the psychological associations, which attach themselves to each of the Olympian gods. And they tell us something very important about how the ancient Greeks understood the divine. To the Greeks, the divine was, to begin with, Zeus. The divine was Zeus. But what does that mean? All right, Ettinger says Zeus was the paternal authority principle. He was a carrier of justice and judgment, an embodiment of the law and the punisher of transgression. He was the personification of creative energy, which constantly spilled out and had the unceasing urge to impregnate, hence his perpetual love affairs. Now, this means something. It means that the divine, God with a capital G, is that which has ultimate authority, that which governs the world and moral action, the lawgiver, that which creates and makes fertile, right? But that's not all. To the Greeks, the divine isn't just Zeus. The divine is also Apollo. And Ettinger says about Apollo, Apollo's attributes are the sun, light, clarity, truth. He represents the principle of rational consciousness. He is golden-haired like the sun. He is an archer who shoots arrows of insight. He is a god of music, history, drama, poetry, dance. All of that belongs to him. Okay, so what does that mean? This means that God is that which illuminates, right? The sun, consciousness, truth, the logos, right? The spirit of order and rationality, the spirit of inspiration, right? Because he's tied to music and poetry and dance. So God is, right? The Zeus spirit, the lawgiver, the authority principle, but he's also the Apollo spirit, the logos, the spirit of inspiration. But that's not all, right? There's many Olympians. So the divine is not just the spirit of Zeus and the spirit of Apollo. The divine is also Hermes. Edinger says about Hermes, he is the divine messenger, and hence something similar to what is symbolized by angels. He is a wind god, and he moves with the wind. He is the god of revelation, the bringer of dreams, the guide of the dark way in the psychopomp. So what does that mean? It means that God is the voice of the divine, which communicates with and connects to the mortal world. Something like that. So to the Greeks, the divine is this Zeus spirit, this Apollo spirit, this Hermes spirit. But we're not done. The divine is also Ares. And Ares is, as Edinger says, the principle of aggressive energy. It also embodies courage and the capacity for aggressive self-assertion, he says. So God or the divine as the spirit of Ares. What does this mean? It means that God is the force of will, that well of energy that can rise up when action is needed, that which moves you to action. That spirit too. But the divine is also Hephaestus. Edinger says of Hephaestus, he is the archetypal inventor and a creative artist. He represents creativity that develops out of a defect or need. Well, that's oddly specific. So what does this mean? This means that God is the spirit of creativity, of ingenuity, of logical problem solving, right? That's the logos again. The spirit that creates in order to overcome. But that's not all, right? The spirit is also Hestia. The divine is also Hestia. Who is she? Edinger tells us Hestia is the goddess of the hearth. She's personified the center of the family and of gatherings of family and clan. She signifies the sacredness of being centered, rooted, and contained in a collective group. Okay, that's the spirit of Hestia. What does that mean? It means that God is the spirit of kinship, connection, the center to which the family identifies, that which unifies many, that which brings people together, the spirit of identity. So the divine is that too. But what about Demeter, the great mother? The divine is also Demeter. And Edinger tells us that Demeter was the earth mother, the embodiment of agriculture. She is the nourishing mother. This means that God is the spirit of nature, of life, fertility, and growing, that which brings what is new into the world and sustains them. The divine is that too. A couple more. The divine is also Aphrodite, right? Edinger tells us of her, Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty, a life-producing principle, the very source of life itself. Aphrodite can be seen internally as the ability to relate to the beautiful. So the divine is also the spirit of Aphrodite. This is God as the erotic spirit, that which brings things together in creative union. God as the beautiful, as Plato would come to articulate in his philosophy. So the divine is also the spirit of Aphrodite. How about Athena? The divine is also Athena. Edinger says she is the principle that brings about civilization, right? She tames the wild instincts, in a manner of speaking. She was a bringer of practical knowledge and wisdom. She was a protector of heroes and brought wise counsel to them. So the divine was also Athena. This is God as the spirit of wisdom, that which intuits right from wrong and the proper path. God as the spirit which resists chaos and entropy. Okay, so when we take the Olympians in as a whole, we begin to see what Ettinger saw. We begin to see what the Greeks understood the divine to be. What is divine in the Olympians varies. But in every case, it is characterized by the same reality. The divine is Zeus and Apollo, and Athena and Demeter, etc. It is everything that these gods represent. And that brings us to Jordan Peterson, We Who Wrestle with God. Now, he has a subtitle for this book, which is going to express kind of where I find this connection here. He calls this Perceptions of the Divine. So, as we just saw Ettinger lay out with what God means, or is from the many examples or archetypes of the Olympian gods, now Peterson suggests, quote, God is a character whose personality reveals itself as the biblical story proceeds, unquote. This is what I meant when I said that Peterson describes God through the narrative framework of the Bible. Okay, rather than using these various gods to do this work, he uses the stories themselves. Okay, let's see this in action. Peterson tells us that in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, that God is the spirit of creation, the creative spirit. This is the God that's described in Genesis 1. Jordan says this, quote, God is the spirit who faces chaos, who confronts the void, the deep, who voluntarily shapes what has not yet been realized and navigates the ever-transforming horizon of the future. God is the spirit who engenders the opposites, light and darkness, earth and water, as well as the possibilities that emerge from the space between them. God creates not only order, but as is stressed repeatedly, order that is good, unquote. So this is the spirit of God that we see in Genesis 1. God is the creative spirit. That's one story. But as the Bible proceeds, we have other classical stories. How about the story of Noah? And Jordan says the story of Noah describes God as the spirit or the call to prepare. Something like an intuition, right? There's something very spiritual about that idea of an intuition. So in the story of Noah, God represents the structure of reality that punishes foolishness and rewards preparedness. Jordan says, quote, to Noah, God was the call to batten down the hatches when chaos looms. Noah was a wise man, and he gets an intuition that all hell is about to break loose. And so you take the appropriate precautions. God is defined in that story as the spirit that comes to the wise to have them prepare in times of trouble, right? The spirit of intuition, of unconscious knowledge, of survival, of that instinct. So God is this too. What about in the story of Abraham? The spirit of God revealed in the story of Abraham is God as the call to adventure. Right? Just like we said, God is Zeus or God is Aphrodite, God is the call to adventure. This is the same type of thing we're doing here. And so in the Abraham story, God is the voice of conscience and destiny. Jordan says, the God who speaks to Abraham is the internal orienting voice that calls a person towards a higher mode of being, even when the path is unclear. In fact, Jordan was on Sean Ryan's podcast, episode 108, if you're interested, where he says, quote, God comes to Abraham as the voice of adventure. Abraham is rich and 70 years old when the story starts. He spent his whole life in his father's tent. God comes along and says, get the hell out of your zone of security. Leave your parents, leave your tent, leave your security, go out into the world. And God makes Abraham a deal. He says, if you abide by the spirit of adventure wholeheartedly, and you make the sacrifices that are necessary, you'll be a blessing to yourself. Your name will become renowned. You'll establish something permanent that's good, and you'll do it in a way that's good for everyone else. Right? God is the spirit of adventure. How about the story of Moses? The Spirit of God is revealed in the story of Moses as the spirit of freedom, you might say. God is the liberating and transforming spirit. In the Moses cycle, God is the force that frees people from tyranny, both external and internal. God is the law-giving principle, right? As Moses received the laws. Jordan says, God is the voice of conscience. So just how we see Ettinger describe the Olympian gods as patterns that represent something true about this divine abstract notion that is essentially unknowable. It's transcendent, and so it's beyond us. And this is why it's unknowable. But we look at the examples of the Olympian gods and we can see patterns that tell us something about this unknowable God. And Jordan says the same thing is true in the narrative structure of the Bible. God is revealed in the stories as he's revealed to Moses and Abraham in these very specific ways. And then what you can do is you can take a look at the whole corpus of associations, and you can thereby know something of the unknowable God. And that brings me to my conclusion. I trust by now you see my point about the human tendency to shy away from abstract ideals, even when they are among our deepest intuitions, in favor of practical, utilitarian ideas. Why remember abstract, transcendent, divine? Why remember God when he's forever out of our reach? Why not instead deal with the divine elements in the world, which we can see and touch and imagine? This only makes sense from a human perspective. But how do we address these divine elements in the world? How do we understand them? How do we form them in our minds so that we can direct our worship and our appeals towards them? Some of that is culturally conditioned, of course, but in general, we recognize patterns of significance and give those patterns name and form through myth and story. It doesn't take much to see overlap, even between the Greek stories and the biblical ones. This overlap is present cross-culturally and as deep back in time as we have evidence. And you may not like what this overlap implies about the nature of the divine, ecumenism, the perennial philosophy, and all of that, but it exists nonetheless. When we look at the creative spirit described in the Genesis story, we see obvious parallels to the spirits described as Demeter, Aphrodite, and even Hephaestus, who are associated with creation, the creation of life, of the earth, of inventions. When we examine one of the more morose characters in the Bible, I'm thinking about the murderer of his own brother, Cain, we find a parallel spirit in the Greek pantheon. And I'm referring to Ares, who is God as the spirit of destruction, say, not unlike deities like Shiva and Kali further to the east. Another principal spirit from the biblical tradition is contained in the story of Moses. This is God as the spirit of law and order, as the moral order. This is reflected in the spirit of Zeus, who is the lawgiver, as well as the spirit of Athena, who tames wild instincts. And a final example, the spirit of Hermes. Now, this is an interesting one because it really represents the connection between the divine and the material, between creator and creation. Hermes was the psychopomp who transfers messages from heaven to earth. But this corresponds to the spirit that spoke to Moses, doesn't it? Through the burning bush. But also in the story of Jacob's ladder, where God's messengers continually move between heaven and earth. So we can see here how it's possible to take a monotheistic ideal and break it down into bite-sized, digestible nuggets. We can also see how these nuggets are not truly independent, but merely expressions of that original ideal. Sure, they may be more practical for human ends, but they're not the truth in its fullness. They are a metaphor. And this explains how monotheism becomes polytheism in a roundabout way. But what about the opposite? What about those monotheistic Reformation movements I mentioned? Like, how do we ever recover the monotheistic ideal once we've abandoned it in the name of convenience? Well, I'm going to let Dr. Peterson answer that question. He says, quote, "The co-occurrence of these stories is the insistence that the call to adventure and the call to prepare are the same thing. That's the monotheism that's underneath it. What the biblical corpus is doing is aggregating visions of what's highest and making the presumption that they are all manifestations of a unity. The monotheistic insistence is that the manifestation of what's highest is the same thing."
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.